Welcome to Farside Friday. My name is Farah Bala. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as a South Asian cisgender woman. I'm here in New York City, founder of Farsight, which is a leadership and organizational development agency that prioritizes and focuses on equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-oppression. Farsight Friday is our community initiative that started in May of 2020 as a response to the heightened levels of hate, the escalation of hate crimes, divisiveness, and vitriol that we are still in the midst of. And our thought process and philosophy is that the antidote to that is to continue to engage in conversation, unpacking nuance and complexity. And that's what this has become over these last 2 years, a space for listening and learning. So let's start off by saying happy Pride and to all of you. And what a great time to have this conversation. And also crucial to remember that we're having this conversation on the eve of Juneteenth, which is on Sunday. And all of this work that we are doing, all of this work around anti-oppression that affects the most vulnerable, the most marginalized of all our communities is on the backs of tremendous tragic loss of life. So we hold space for that. I am so excited to introduce our incredible guests for this conversation on gender identity. And please join me in welcoming Stephanie Battaglino, Rej Joo, Chris Mossiah, and Gentle Ramirez, who is a Farsight Friday alum. Gentle was with us in the summer of 2020 for the Young Leader Roundtable. And so thank you all for joining us. I am going to hand it over to you to please introduce yourselves to us.
Stephanie Battaglino, my pronouns are she and hers. I had a 40-year corporate career. I was corporate vice president at New York Life when I first came out as the first trans person in the history of New York Life to come out back in 2005. Since that time, I have developed a speaking, consulting, training a consultancy called Follow Your Heart LLC. You can find me on the web at stephaniebattaglino.com. And it really is kind of an outgrowth of my coming out in the workplace. What I found as being a proud member of the trans community that no one's going to do it for us. We have our allies and we have our advocates, and we try to add to those numbers. But at the end of the day, there's power in our stories, and we need to raise up those stories so that we can counteract what's happening. I hope I've done a little bit of that over the course of 17 years of doing this work, and I'm thrilled to be here today.
Hey everyone, my name is Chris Mossiah. My pronouns are they, them. I am a vice president, product manager in JP Morgan. And that's what I do by day. By night, I always say this, I'm an LGBT plus Avenger. So I wear many hats within the space for supporting and advocating LGBT plus individuals, specifically trans and gender expansive individuals within the firm. And so I am a part of the TGNC, Transgender Nonconforming Subcommittee within Pride BRD, the Tri-State chapter. I am also the co-chair for the Gender Expansive Council, which is specific to trans and gender expansive employees and families of individuals who are trans and gender expansive. I also I wear a hat for open finance, so I'm also part of their subcommittee called TNI, which is trans, non-binary, and intersex. I'm also on the LGBT plus CUNY, City University of New York Advisory Council. So those are just a few hats that I wear to really advocate for individuals within our community. I enjoy my time doing that. And I'm very, very thankful for you all having me here today.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Gentle Ramirez. I am a full-time software engineer at JP Morgan Chase. And I'm also a lifelong student of the world. I highly identify with my global experiences and global perspective as aspiring expat um, as long as I can. Locally in New York, when I'm here, I've been a part of the Out in Tech and Out for Undergrad organization. At my recent university, New York University, I was an inaugural member of the FICWA organization, the NYU LGBTQ Center. And I have a lot of years doing this work. Farah and I go back to 2020, as she mentioned. And I'm really grateful that my voice has been uplifted in this program as well as in other spaces. And I'm really excited to engage in conversation with everyone today. So thank you for having me again.
Hi everyone, I'm Rej. I use he, him pronouns. I guess to kind of describe who I am, what I do, I guess I'll just kind of compartmentalize it. That's sort of how I'm a list type of guy. So academically, my background is in public health, but in terms of my work experience, I've been involved with direct service, research, community-based education, training, and anti-violence work. And I have worked with an array of marginalized communities, ranging from houseless LGBTQ youth to people who are affected by HIV, AIDS, as well as mental health issues. And more recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, have been working greatly with survivors of particularly domestic violence, intimate partner violence, as well as identity-based violence. And so I had a great opportunity to teach self-defense, de-escalation, upstander work with the last organization I was with. And so from that, I myself and a friend of mine started an organization last year that is centering the safety and the well-being of trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming people, particularly BIPOC folks. And so we offer self-defense classes as well as distributing safety kits. So that's currently what I'm sort of focusing on, but I dabble myself in many different fields, I guess, if you so to speak, as well as various communities. And I'm just really excited to be a part of this conversation today.
I want to piggyback on this concept of safety for our communities, and specifically for our trans, non-binary, LGBTQ plus communities. From your lived experience, where are we at today with this conversation, with levels of acceptance, with levels of normalization? Where are we at?
When we think about the trans community, we also have to just like any communities, right? There's a huge diversity within that community, and based on your location, your socioeconomic class, racial background, all of those things, immigration status, that where we are is going to be on a whole different spectrum. And we just know that generally, at least the work that I'm doing around safety, we have noticed that the bigger or the increase in visibility in media as well as just community, and also in legal terms too, that we have noticed a lot more attacks and harassment against trans people, particularly BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So for example, just a few days ago, Miss Hall, based in Dallas, she's a Black trans woman who was not well mentally and was basically detained, but in a fashion that was, they put some kind of something like spit device over her face and she couldn't breathe and she ended up dying. They misgendered her in the media, right? These are happening, but we noticed also in the beginning of the pandemic that the number of murder of trans folks it spiked up, right? It was in the 40s. And then we thought it was gonna go back down last year. In fact, it went up almost close to 60, being the highest. And so when we think about where we are in terms of the trans community, I think overall laws have improved, right? So for example, in New York City, now you can designate, individuals designate X as a gender rather than male or female. So there, in terms of general legislation or I mean, actually that's questionable because now things are being contested and whatnot, but in terms of interpersonal safety for people in the margins of the margins, From my experience, the work experience I have, I've noticed definitely a spike along with the visibility.
I like what you said, Reg, because the visibility is a huge thing, right? And so that is where we've come a long way. Many of us who are over a certain age, we couldn't come out and be ourselves, right? So a lot of us stayed in the closet for however long, for whatever reason, right? Not just sexual orientation, but also gender identity. And in some ways, gender expression, right? A lot of people had two sides to a closet in the 90s and the 80s, and even before that. The visibility part of it is where we can say, I don't want to say that we've won, but we have stepped into a little bit of acceptance. Where we have a long way to go. And when we look ahead, that road is very long. And it's because now that we are visible, now they want to push us back in a way where when we weren't visible, okay, just let them have, nobody really sees that community anyway. The legislation is huge to push us back. They're attacking us. There are over 300 anti-LGBT plus bills in the United States alone. That's an attack. When we just wanted visibility, we needed allies. We don't need allies anymore. We've got enough of those. We need advocates because this is an attack now. And so there is a real fight. And in that fight, allies, hey, I'm going to do this for you. I'd like to give a little bit of a donation here, whatever I can do. We need your voice now. We need you to speak up. And being an advocate requires a lot more than being an ally. And so because this fight is so big, we need an army of advocates. And I think that's where we have a long way to go. Because while we have a lot of individuals who are willing to learn, I just want to learn more. What can I do to be a better ally? Some of those individuals don't want to fight with us. And that's what we need now. We're already visible. As much as we'd like to be more visible, we're visible more than we've ever been before. And because of that attack is happening, and it is happening rapidly. And so now is the call to action for advocates. And so when you have advocates, and people are fighting for you, there will be less people to be harmed. There will be less people that may die. When people have an army to fight with, less of that happens. Right now, we don't have that. And so this is the reason why it is hard being who we are. And in some places and in some, not just outside of the US, but in the US, it is unsafe.
Let me just tag on to that too. So here we are in Pride Month, right? Well, guess what? I'm trans 24/7, 365 days a year. So ask yourself from an ally or advocate perspective, because I'm so right where Chris is on this. Are you going to be an ally with a small a, or are you going to be an ally with a capital A? Is the pride flag going to go away from your cubicle or wherever your Zoom screen takes you when the calendar flips from June 30th to July 1st? I mean, and if it does, then are you really an ally to begin with, right? That's what you have to ask yourself, because we need people to walk in solidarity and stand in solidarity with us, because as Chris had mentioned, and Reg alluded to it as well, we are under attack. There's no question about it. The backlash is happening. We are now as a community. Now, look, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, and I'm some white chick, with some measure of privilege that has been bestowed upon me because of kind of where I sit in society. So, but you need to understand that there are other forces that are happening that are taking our community and creating a political wedge issue out of who we are. And that's not going away. let's just set the context for this conversation that we're having, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are a lot of other things going on in our society that this is happening against. Here we are in Pride Month. Here we are under attack with all these state-sponsored bills, creating laws for problems that don't really exist. They didn't, the attack on the bathrooms didn't work. So now it's trans kids in sports, and it's everything else. And a lot of it, and let's not kid ourselves, is rooted in white supremacy. Let's just, hey, we're all family here. Let's just talk, as my uncles would say from downtown Jersey City. That's where it's all rooted in. If you just peel back the onion a little bit and think about it for a second. So, yeah, we've made some strides, I think about the Title VII ruling last year in the Supreme Court. That was huge. Amy, may you rest in peace. For the trans community specifically, but there are people that are poised to roll it all back in a heartbeat. And that's why we need people that will stand and fight with us.
Thank you all. Just to wrap up that question, I think we're at a space where we have come a long way. And legislatively, we see the attack on trans people existing that ultimately attack cis people existing. They don't want trans girls on girls' sports teams, and now all girls have to be examined. What does that do for the cis experience, the trans experience, these young adolescents understanding gender? We're at a space where I remember the big Olympic Caster Semenya athlete who is a cis woman who is not legally able to compete in her field, in her track and field event. The back and forth, the backlash to use biology and to use biological determinism to determine whether or not she earns her medals is just, we're seeing that not only are trans people under attack, but this attacks cis women and cis people existing as well. So just as Stephanie said, we are in a space of a white supremacist late stage capitalism where there is a force trying to roll back all progress. And I think maybe the ally question or settlement or how we come to terms with that is we see that these anti-trans bills affect everyone, not just trans people. And so when I think an ally can see that, oh, this is going to affect me, I don't need to see a trans person as other, but more of we're the same, or we're both going to be impacted directly or indirectly, I think is where we see allies and advocates step up. And it's a bit more personal to their experience. I think there's a level of tokenization of trans people in the sense of if they're normalized, if trans people are normalized in society, I would say tokenized is the word. If they are passing or not, if they are wealthy or not, as Rej mentioned, their positionality, their intersectionality influences their level or how they are received in the world. So.
A lot of us may already know this, but I think just from, I came out 2003, 4, so just I guess 20 years back, there was no visibility. There's very little visibility in terms of identities that are more on the non-binary aspect of the trans umbrella. So I feel like if there was any kind of push, right, since a couple decades ago, there's greater visibility and acknowledgement of non-binary, genderqueer, agender folks than the not traditional but previous trans umbrella. So I wanted to also put that out there.
Thank you. I want to stay in the space of allyship is not enough. We need more advocates. We need collective fight, and then ally with a capital A. That's what I'm hearing. And I want to tie it into one of our questions that we got from one of our registrants. I'm curious about any thoughts on the trend of rainbow washing performed by large corporations in June and then abandoned the other 11 months of the year. And full disclosure, I was telling you all this before we started. This was the very first time I had heard of the term rainbow washing. So for any one of our listeners who are unfamiliar with that term, it's the act of using or adding rainbow colors and or imagery to advertising, apparel, accessories, landmarks in order to indicate progressive support for the LGBTQ equality and earn consumer credibility, but with a minimum of effort or pragmatic result. And I hear that tokenizing that Jendal was just speaking of. Can you break down, what does that look like? What does fighting together look like? What, like if there were some actionable steps, right? I heard bathrooms, I heard application having options outside of the binary. What else can we do? What else does this community need in society, in organizations? Yes, Chris.
Helping to normalize what society deemed wasn't normal, right? So pronouns, even though we all have them, society made it so that it wasn't something that we needed to advertise or show, but it is necessary, right? It helps to combat misgendering. It also helps for, and I always say this, pronouns isn't always, people usually put pronouns in the category of the LGBTQ plus community. Oh, well, I'm not a part of that community, so I don't need to put my pronouns in. But if you have them, you have a name, right? So then you have pronouns, use them. Because the reality is we're all from different places. And as an American, I may not know some people's names that are from other areas of the world. And I don't know if that is naturally a more masculine or more feminine name, right? So I would assume, and then why would I assume? Why take that? Why make me have to do that? Where then you have to then say, no, by the way, you know, that person is XYZ, however they identify, right? Why don't you just put that in your Zoom so that whenever I speak of that person, in your signature as well, whenever I speak of that person, I know to use those pronouns. It's interesting when you mentioned the rainbow washing, because I had an individual who was straight and an ally ask me, what is the problem with us, you know, basically commercializing, you know, Pride Month? And I said, people don't want you to benefit and profit off of their struggles. And the whole word pride comes from being pushed to the side. That's not just in the LGBTQ community, right? I'm Black and I have Black pride. Because as a Black person, I have been pushed to the side. And so as a person in the LGBT plus community, just even being born in the 80s and growing up in the 90s, and now being out past then, I have been pushed to the side. The community, I've watched the community be pushed to the side in so many different ways. And that right there is struggle. And we won't talk about even just the unsafe part of it. Nobody wants you to profit off of that, right? And I wanted him to understand that you can't make money off of people's trials and tribulations, right? But there's another side of it that I understand. This is also helping the visibility that we are all asking to normalize. If these companies didn't do this, then there would be no commercials. If there were no commercials, it wouldn't be as normal in society as it is now. So it's like a double-edged sword. If you want to do the Pride Month, that's fine, but do other things inside of it. Like there are benefits for trans folks. Why don't you start looking into that if you don't have that in your company? Pronouns, I could talk about pronouns all day. Self-ID, right? have these programs in place in your company. That way, when Pride Month comes, you can say, "Oh, we're doing other stuff." we want to uplift our LGBT plus employees as well during this time.
To piggyback on Chris's point, I think the issue I have with the commercialization of pride flags and all that, it's not those things in and of itself. Because in fact, if I take myself back 10, 20 years back when I was doing cultural competency trainings on, for LGBTQ community, something that we pushed a lot was to advertise yourself as an ally by putting rainbow. So in fact, years ago, we needed that. But the problem with this commercialization, I think, is that corporations or businesses think that's all they have to do, right? And it becomes a performative thing to advertise yourself as an ally. But we know that true allyship or advocacy doesn't stop at putting a sticker, right? And I think that's when people just think, I got that check off, right? I'm a good ally. When in fact, I would, as a person in this community navigating the world, I'd rather know that this company, I know that the intake form is on point, meaning they offer more than 2 gender boxes, right? I want to make sure that their employees, their benefits in terms of trans benefits or just LGBTQ inclusive benefits, that includes family building, right? Benefits, that they think about that, assuming that they have employees who are LGBTQ, not thinking, oh, do we even have, right? So I'd rather see companies and groups and entities quietly do these things that actually makes a difference in LGBTQ people's lives, rather than saying, ooh, we're gonna march at Pride, blah, blah, blah. And that's it. So it's, for me, it's not an or, it's an and. Just do that. And are you backing it up? How are you supporting your own employees? How are you supporting your own communities? And so when it becomes more, the commercialization becomes more performative, I think that's where I get a little bit little iffy. But I also don't want to say don't do that, because I think it's not about pendulum swinging. It's not saying don't have rainbow flag, because it is important. That visibility is important, right? But we need to go further. If we truly want to make a difference in the lives of trans folk, non-binary, and then queer folks.
The further that we need to go is reparations. And it is something that is missing from the commercialization efforts. When you make $1 million off of selling a rainbow shirt, I don't know, say Gap as a corporation, $1 million off of this design, is that profit going to directly benefit the community during Pride Month, or is it going to go towards the endowment of the corporation? And while the commercialization is great, we all want, Pride swag and the visibility is great, the profits don't go directly towards LGBTQ people. They are, like, I don't want to say a majority of unhoused, but the unhoused trans folks are left vulnerable. After the celebration ends, there's trash in the streets, and these are where people live their lives 365 days a year, not just the neighborhood that people go to do pride tourism, and they have all the historic landmarks in New York City, and they're trashed the weekend after.
I mean, for me, it boils down to, like, I do a lot of work with companies. That's kind of where I do most of my work, because, as a kind of a corporate person for 40 years, that seemed to be where I could make the most impact. And for me, it really boils down to, do you walk the walk and do you talk the talk? And what I often say to companies, it's like, you need to first, change happens organically within your culture and then outward. It's one thing to do all this, all the PR stuff. And a lot of that, quite frankly, is promulgated by things like, and this isn't necessarily a knock on it by any stretch of the imagination, but HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, has something called the Corporate Equality Index. Where you can be, stamped as a, LGBTQ business, to do business with if you get a 100 perfect score. And the good news is that survey has evolved over time, and it includes a lot of trans inclusive things that need to happen for you maintain a perfect score, you know, like trans-inclusive health benefits. And there's things in there about supporting the community and all that kind of stuff. And that is great. But the other side of that is that the way the Corporate Equality Index, so it's meant to hold companies, law firms, healthcare providers accountable. But the problem with that is, and this is kind of the other side of the coin, is it's a self-directed survey. So somebody in DEI within an HR department in, pick a company, Levi Strauss, is filling that out saying, oh yeah, we do that. And we do that. Well, do you really? You better, or really what you're reporting is false, right? So there's that. But what I try to tell folks is, it's like, if you want change to happen within your culture, first be aware of it. You know, again, real big on context. You know, you do your work every single day against the backdrop of the culture of your company. So what are you doing to push the envelope? What are you doing to expand that inclusivity narrative within your company? Because it's those sorts of things that will then back up what you're saying externally. Because there's an awful lot of potential dissonance if you're out there saying, yay, pride, but internally you don't have any protections for your trans and non-binary and gender expansive employees. So you have to be aware of what's happening so that you can create the change that you see. A lot of it has to do with language. A lot of it has to do with education. A lot of it has to do with pronouns, using pronouns as catalysts for cultural change. Think about that for a second. You know, what I was just doing a training this morning with Northwell Health in New York City. And I said, you know, words are important. You know, our lexicon is evolving. You know, the lexicon will have changed from the time we started this panel to the time it ended, right? So, but it's not just the words. It's about your intentionality behind those words. It's the authentic intent that you bring to that exchange as you, perhaps for the first time in your life, try to meet a trans-identified person where they are. And that's what you have to be mindful of. So in many respects, Farah, it's just a constant banging of the drum of this sort of narrative so people can get it. You can't stand still, even if you've got your perfect score on the Corporate Equality Index. That's great. And companies there are a lot of companies are great about that, but you can't rest on your laurels. You have to continue to move forward. And that's because that's where the change is. And that's where the evolution is.
You know, we're talking systems policy is what can advocates do? What should we be mindful of in how we show up with our LGBTQ plus community? What is that? You know, there's that self-education, and then there's hopefully organizational support for education. And what else? That's where I want to dive into a little bit.
But you need education in order to speak up. In order to fight with your words, you have to know what you're talking about. Otherwise, they're empty words. And that's a big thing that advocates can do. Because anybody who is we're all advocates for each other in this space anyway. There are parts of you all on this conversation that may not know parts of me, and so on and so forth. So we're all advocates for each other, but there are people who are not a part of this community within themselves other than being advocates. And so because of that, they have a voice that we don't, and you have to use it. Because we can say all of the things we need to say to legislation, to these companies, to people of power in general, and they won't hear us. They already don't see us. They don't see us. Not that we don't have visibility, they don't see us. We need the people that they can see to speak up. And I said this before, and I say it all the time, and I'm always going to say this. Martin Luther King's, one of his famous quotes, because he's got so many, is, in the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And you cannot say you are my friend if you are silent when something's happening to me or anyone in my community.
Amen to that, Chris. And the way I like to kind of frame that too, and I'm so glad you brought that up. I wrote that quote down because I always forget it. The way I like to frame that piece of how to be a better ally, moving from small a to capital A, is you're going to be confronted with teaching moments. They may not at your workplace, in your social circle, wherever. You're going to be confronted with teaching moments. It may happen tomorrow. It may happen next week. It may happen next month. It may happen next year. But you're going to find yourself in a situation where you are with someone who is speaking perhaps very pejoratively about our community. So that's your moment. You know, you want to talk, Farah, about moving the needle. That's the moment where the needle gets moved or it goes backward. And that's where individually you can make an impact. You either stay silent, and Chris has already told us what happens when you do that, or you either speak up because you know better. You know better. You've raised your hand and you said, I am an ally. Well, now's your chance to prove it. And that's what creates the change. You correct the individual. I don't care if they don't like it. You shouldn't care if they don't like it. You got to be diligent. You got to be diligent. It's in those moments where that kind of crystallization happens and where you truly are an advocate, because I may not be there, but you're standing up for me in that moment. So it's how you meet the moment that will really carry the day in terms of your advocacy and your allyship and your support of our community.
Transphobia is not on trans people to solve, because it didn't start with trans people. It is up to, I'm gonna misquote it. I know Chris has the quotes memorized. I'm gonna misquote Assata Shakur, and I gotta revisit that book. Black Panther Party members and Assata Shakur cannot change the hearts and minds of white people. It is white people who will go out and educate other white people in the context of gender identity and transphobia, anti-trans manifestations that we're seeing. When trans people are not in the room, the transphobia that happens cannot be, we can't wait until a trans person comes into the space to educate everybody. And as an advocate and as a big capital A ally, when we're not in the space, are you speaking up? Are you doing that work to stop the transphobia before it harms a trans person, and disrupt that cycle?
Yeah, Gentle, I love that. I love that point, because something that comes to mind is, I mentioned earlier that my work years ago was sort of framed around cultural competency, right? Obviously, that's not the framework that I use. It's more about cultural humility, meaning when we try to become an ally or an advocate, right? It's not about knowing more about the other culture. It's really to find humility in yourself and self-reflect and know about your own lens in which you see other cultures, rather than I want to learn more about that culture. That's not culturally being competent, right? So if we were to think about cultural humility framework, and your positionality around, I want to be an ally or advocate, I think it's really coming back to this idea that just acknowledging that you have a gender identity as a cisgender person, you have a sexual orientation as a straight person, and that when you do have it, when you name it, and to investigate, how am I benefiting because of the way our society is structured? How am I benefiting as a cisgender person, as a straight person, that trans brothers and sisters or siblings do not have, right? So it's just like, not just like, but similar to how some white people, if they don't investigate their white privilege, they say, I don't see race, I'm not really white, I don't identify my, right? They don't even acknowledge their privilege as a white person. And sometimes when we get into that kind of like, I accept everyone, and I don't care if you're trans, but you don't even accept the fact that you are cis and that there's privileges attached to that, what that tells me is that you don't see the lack of privilege or lack of access that I have to navigate when you don't acknowledge your own stuff. So I think for me, it's really to encourage people who are cis to kind of investigate, what does that mean the fact that I can go to a public restroom without even thinking that I have to choose, whereas for non-binary people, it's a day-to-day, hour-to-hour stress that lives in people's bodies, right? Just even that's one example, right? There's so many things that I could go down the list, but I think investigating those aspects of ourselves so that it's a good reflection on how other communities, my siblings, my brothers and sisters, do not have that. I think it's a great place to sort of find humility, right? Rather than I want to know how to know more about those like terminologies, because as people here shared, it's going to change within this hour. So for me, it's really coming back to self-reflection and that aspect of humility.
Staying within advocacy, another aspect that's happening within organizations is we are hearing, I'm now okay with, LG in LGBTQ plus, but I'm still not wrapping my head around BTQ plus. I don't get it, right? And these are folk in, excuse me, high levels of power and responsibility and positionality at organizations whose decisions can make or break someone's sense of belonging and psychological safety and wellness at an organization. On the other hand, some of those same people are having very vulnerable experiences at home with children who are exploring their gender.
So if this individual who's in some seat of power isn't getting the whole BTQIA plus thing, my first reaction with my inside voice, which will now become my outside voice, is like, what planet have you been on? It's like, dude, really? Really? You got to be kidding me. And if in fact that individual is dealing with a gender expansive child at home, it's like, to me, and I don't mean to be glib here or anything, it's like, how many multiple levels of denial are going on here? Really? And are you bringing that to the party, into the workplace? And I'm not a psychiatrist and I'm not a therapist, and I would not want to psychoanalyze this individual, but it's like, what are you not recognizing here that's happening at home, or that you perhaps don't want to recognize? And you're bringing that mindset into the workplace, and you're saying, oh, I get the L and the G thing. That was easy. But this trans stuff, this bi stuff, what's that all about? Seems to me there's an awful lot of bleed over. Part of the answer is, you're responsible for an awful lot of people in your role of work. Now what's not happening here is vulnerability. What's your relationship with vulnerability? Because you need to open yourself up to learning and to new things and to dealing with complex situations. You have to allow yourself to be vulnerable. You have to allow yourself to say, I don't have the answer to everything. This individual might think they have the answer to everything, but it's wrong. You got to step back from that. And that's hard for a lot of people, especially, and I've been on both sides of it, in my corporate life. Especially if you've held white male privilege for a long time. It's like, in my own personal journey, it's like, I didn't really think too much about the white privilege that I had for the first 25 years of my corporate life. But after I came out and still had 15 more years of career as my authentic self, I sure felt its loss. So that's my own personal relationship with privilege. But you need to, so there, in my view, there's a lot going on there.
My first light bulb was assimilation. If someone can accept the L and the G, it's how well do those L and Gs assimilate to the dominant culture. The further you are to proximity to white supremacy, the harder it is to assimilate. And so those closest to those with the most proximity, of course, eventually through their assimilation and internalized behaviors of the external world will definitely blend into the corporate space. That's a high possibility. That's probably what is manifested in this person's life. You mentioned then that they have a direct contact with this young child, with their child at home. And I would then say that they've always had direct contact to gender expansiveness. And if their workplace completely mirrors them, that's a manifestation of contact with gender identity, despite it being cis, or as well as being cis. And then my last point that came to mind was children and the work that children do and the second lives that parents live after having children, and how much they learn and how much they grow and how much the world changes after having children. So I'm not saying it's this child's responsibility to educate this parent, but the ability for this child to like as your scenario said that this person is having contact with this gender expansive experience through this child. That's the ability of children and the next generation coming up, and how beautiful that sounds to me.
Can I ask, Farah, did you clarify that a little bit?
As someone who's working with organizations, who is constantly opening space for complexity, this is a complexity that comes up a lot. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, where it is. And I just love that this articulation that, both of you, Stephanie and Gentle, are bringing in around the duality of life, like almost like a double life experience, and that space of denial or lack of acceptance, and whether that's of self, whether that's of identity.
If I were to talk to that person, I would say, okay, so you don't understand. That's fine, right? Sometimes we just don't understand certain things. That's okay. Now, are you curious to understand? Are you curious? Are you willing to learn more? Depending on their response, I think how we go about could vary, right? So for example, someone's like, yeah, I'm wanting to learn. Great. Then we go in this direction. If they're like, I don't really care, I would say, well, you don't have to understand to radically accept or love someone that you love, right? So sometimes we think we have to know in order to like be accepting or inclusive, but honestly, if we wait for that, this world will not be in a good shape. So I would say kind of start from there. Like, what is your intention? So fine, you don't understand it. Are you willing to or not, right? Something that people brought up that I really like and resonate is also, this is an opportunity to reflect on your own. Why is it that it's hard for you to understand that? Is it because you grew up with just knowing that there's only two genders and this was reinforced over and over for decades, right? If we look at other cultures, that is not the reality. Other culture, indigenous culture particularly throughout history, have offered a spectrum of ways to be around community in terms of gender roles and so forth. So it's kind of examining that, but obviously they would have to be open to that conversation. So I'll kind of leave it there.
I think, first of all, we keep talking about comfort, right? The uncomfortable conversations. I have a very older member in my family who used to always tell me that comfort is a wonderful place, but nothing grows there. I welcome the uncomfortable anything because that means I'm growing. When it gets too comfortable, I'm not. Or maybe I've become an expert in something and I need to get back into that uncomfortable side of things. When people say they don't understand something, oh, I get the L and the G, but everything else I don't get. Well, that's because the L and the G have been visible for quite some time. There was a time when you didn't get that either, right? And so the whole community, you said you didn't understand, right? And now, in a sense, the L and the G have become the majority within the community. Within our own community, they have the louder voice, right? But here's the reality of it, and I always keep pointing it back to education. When people say, what can I do? Well, educate yourself. So if you don't understand something, educate yourself. I'm the first person to say, if I don't get it, I'm gonna Google it, because Google is your friend. So I'm gonna Google it and find whatever resources I need to find so that it is no longer uncomfortable for me, right? That means I have grown in that space. Now, if we're gonna talk about history and gender, There have been multiple genders since BC. Mesopotamia, they were called Hijra. In the Polynesian culture, they were called Mahu. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is when society wanted to make everything common. And it also dates back to the churches, right? But we won't get into that. When they wanted everything common, is they wanted you to fit in the box that they were comfortable for you to be in, for them. I need to know what I need to call you. Why? For you? For you to be comfortable? You don't need to know anything other than I hope I'm a nice person, I'm a kind person, and I'm trying to do good in this world. That's all you need to know. But because of your own comfort or discomfort, you need to put me in a box. But we're breaking those boxes. We're breaking out of those boxes and we're breaking those ceilings. Stephanie, you can plug that later. Those glass ceilings, right? We're breaking that, right? And that's because of education. So when you say, I don't get trans, I don't get non, I don't get all these actual genders, you should probably start reading a book because they're there, because it's not new.
Speaking of leadership, Chris, something that I keep pushing and drumbeating, it's a lack of visibility at those levels, right? We're talking about advocacy, and where is the visibility within a society and within an organization? And does that visibility have positionality of power? And because there is advocacy to be done up there at that level as well, right? The normalization of those conversations, to your point, when they're unfamiliar, they're more uncomfortable because they're so distant. I want to tie in this education theme and parenting. We have a question from one of our listeners. I have a child who is 12, almost 13, who identifies as trans, though I would say that other than changing his pronouns, I'm not seeing other signals that he may be on a journey to re-identify as male instead of female. Aside from changing labels and encouraging open expression, are there other ways to support a gender non-conforming person at this age? Thank you.
First of all, I just want to say that's great. Amazing. Whoever, if you're the parent of that child, yeah, thank you. There's so many things that people, a lot of parents, and you know, with good intentions, forget. And so the fact that this parent is thinking about what else can I do is a great, I think, it's just a gesture of love that makes my heart really warm. So thank you for that. I would just kind of let the child lead. We also know that gender expansive youth, some youth young people show really high level of gender dysphoria, and they're more likely to sort of like stay with their gender identity that they affirmed for themselves. But there are a lot of other gender expansive youth that may want to change. And the fact that we have parents out there that are open to let this kids lead, right? With the understanding that their surrounding might not be safe. So just making sure that those things are in place. But I think I love it when parents are sort of letting the child lead. It doesn't mean just let the child run wild, right, without discipline. It means that if they're like wanting to talk about gender or explore different gender identity or clothing, right, or how they want to express, I think just the fact that there's an adult figure that can have that conversation is so affirming, right? Rather, often a lot of trans folks as an adult, we look back and we're like, there's so many repressive memories of adults telling us, you're not supposed to do that because you're this gender, right? So anytime an adult figure, parent, whoever, can just be present with those conversations or explore, and sometimes just by talking, they're like, oh, actually, never mind, I'm not interested. And all they did was just be present with that young person and trust that if we follow them in a supportive manner, that they'll find the right kind of who they are. And so I just want to circle back and say thank you for that parent, whoever wrote that question.
The first thing that I say, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that I've been on PFLAG National's board now for about 8 years, is find community to the extent that you can, you know, and community for your child and community for you. And, and Reg, like you said, kudos to you for your courage, for your vulnerability, for your allowing yourself to let your child lead when probably everything is screaming internally at you to say, no, I just want to hold on to my child and protect him from the outside. But find community, there's, there's, and I don't mean to do a commercial for PFLAG, but I mean, there's 300 chapters from coast to coast, depending, excuse me, on where you live. There may be one or several that are near you, and they're all trans inclusive. So that's a place, your local LGBTQ community center. If you live in a metro area, might be another place. But yeah, find community as you let your child live into themselves each day, and it's little things. It's a preponderance of little things. It's not necessarily big sweeping things, and walk the journey together. That's what I would say too.
Thank you for that resource, Reg. Trans Youth Family Allies. How do you respond when someone asks you an inappropriate question at work? For example, an unprovoked question about your personal medical transition, or someone asking you to justify why they should respect your pronouns?
So I don't get the medical history question. That's not what I would get, but I do get the why should I respect your pronouns? Especially when people say, oh, it's just really hard because I'm a grammar buff, and I just let them speak because I come from an entire family of English professors and, educators, editors, journalists, and they can use it. I don't know how to use that in a singular context. And I said, yes, you do. You just don't know that you do because it's done unconsciously. But if somebody left something on the table, like a wallet, and you were pointing it out and you said, someone left their wallet on the table, look at what you just did. Someone left their wallet on the table. But see, here's the thing, the mind and the eye play a trick. And because you couldn't see that person, you gave that person they, them pronouns. But because you can see me, your eye says to your mind, that's a woman, she, her pronouns. And so for you, you can't unlearn what you've learned. But we unlearn things all the time. And then we relearn what we're supposed to. The whole I don't get or why should I respect? Well, first of all, we should all be respecting each other. So if you start off the sentence with why should I respect, you have started that sentence off wrong. Because in this world, we should be respecting each other. It costs nothing to give somebody respect and kindness. So if you tell me your pronouns are something I'm not used to, because I respect you, I should be, and I should try to use those pronouns. And if it's not out of malicious intent, then your misgendering can be corrected as long as you are trying. And that trying usually happens when that person isn't there, because that's when you're using that person's pronouns. And so that's where you should be practicing to use that person's pronouns. You don't do it in their face to respect them at that moment. If you're respecting them, you should respect them when their back is turned, when you're speaking of them.
So in my personal life, I know this is a question about work, but people pay me when they misgender me. It is a $50 fee, to be specific. And if it happens multiple times with either, colloquialisms of references to gender, I get paid a lot. In work, there is a pressure to be the likable person, to network, and this person can be useful in, I don't know, a year from now. If they don't make you feel good and don't respect you, it's okay to place people where they are, leave them where they are if they're not showing forms of effort to respect you. Despite being a colleague, despite being a team member, there's a level of, we can just be coworkers, we can just be colleagues. That's okay to do.
One thing I want to add to the inappropriate questions at work, because I've gotten this so many times, especially around medicalization of transitioning and all of that, body parts. I usually put it back on them saying, hey, you know, I'd be happy to talk about my genitals if you're willing to talk about your genitals. And then they realize how inappropriate it is. Why is it that trans bodies could be up for grabs for public gaze and discussion, but not your body as a cis woman, because that's inappropriate. That's right. So then I just put it back. It's like, hey, I'm open books, but you have to also share about your genitalia and whether you had this work done or that work done. And or sometimes I just say, oh, you know what? I don't feel comfortable talking about it, and keeping it neutral, right? Because sometimes you don't know their intention. It might be with good intention, so they realize, oh, that's my cue, that was inappropriate, or they maybe wanted to incite something or like provoke something, and so when you stay neutral, it's like, no, actually, I don't talk about that, right? Or like, oh yeah, I just had surgery. It was pretty serious, and I've had this happen actually, because I had medical procedures done, many of them, and there's scarrings and this and this and that, and so when people ask, I kind of keep it neutral and say, yeah, I had surgery, and they're like, what kind? It's like, yeah, it was pretty intense, and then I switch it up. So I think there are ways that we don't necessarily have to address exactly where they want to take us. We can take control of how we want to tell our story. And so I guess I sort of stick to those two strategies. One is to put it back on them. Second one is to kind of keep it general and keep it moving and keep it neutral.
I, at times, have said it's none of your business, at the risk of being blunt, but what are you going to do? If the situation calls for it, you know, I mean, you know, I think a lot of it is rooted in, and I'm not making excuses for the individuals that are knuckleheads, but I think it's, you know, there's been, and it goes back to the language conversation, I think, you know, a lot of the language around the trans community has been so sexualized over the years. You know, transsexual was okay for at one point in time in the past. You know, I can remember trans people self-identifying as post-operative and pre-operative. It's not cool to do that anymore, but that, you know, but there are vestiges of that, I think, that are still kind of, you know, that are out there in the culture to some degree. And, you know, what I often say to people is, it's like, look, you know, my surgical history is really none of your business, nor is your surgical history any of my business. When I'm meeting you for the first time, I don't ask, hey, Farah, it's nice to meet you. Have you had your gallbladder taken out? You know, I mean, it's none of my business. I don't care. I shouldn't care. And, you know, so, but we've seen it happen in public spaces, right? When Katie Couric was asking the two trans women, and one of them was Laverne, I think, right? You know, have you had the surgery? Katie, it's none of your business. And I think Larry King did the same thing with someone else. It's like, no, it's none of your business. It's, you know, and I think it's important for people to understand that's a no-fly zone, man. That's not where you're supposed to go, because it wouldn't be for me to you.
I have to name that this is that level of entitlement, right? That folk feel that they can come with and eschew their opinion in a question that is so, I have no words, and which is why this concept of cultural humility that Rej, you're bringing into the space is so crucial. What right do we have to step into someone else's personal, deeply intimate spaces? We have to earn that right. And what does it take to earn the right to ask a question? It's about engaging in relationality. It's about staying in a space of learning and unlearning.
Farah, let me just tag on to that, because
yeah,
when I find myself in like a training environment, right? And, and we're going through terminology and pronouns and do's and don'ts of language and dimensions of gender and how it frames our language and all this kind of stuff. What I typically say to people is it's like, look, I understand that for the uninitiated, this can, your head is swimming right now. But what I often say is, look, if everything else fails you, let your actions ride on the rails of your own personal sense of integrity, grace, and respect. What I'm getting out of this conversation, and Reg, thanks for bringing this stuff up. It's what if you're like completely unaware of what your own personal sense of integrity, grace, and respect is? Are you that tone deaf? But to your point, Farah, I think, for some people that are just blinded by their privilege, it can happen, and happens more often than we think.
And by the way, people who ask this, sometimes it's not just strangers. It might be one of your kind of friends or colleagues that you're kind of close to, and they really mean well, but it's still not appropriate, and they don't know it. And that's why I think coming from a neutral standpoint can really help them check themselves, right? Put a mirror and say, no, I just had to, right? Or something, so that it's not about attacking them, right? But I also know that in order to be in that kind of mental space, I have to be in the right space. And also that brings me back and reminds me that, Farah, you said, how can we remind them that they don't have that they're kind of functioning from that sense of entitlement, right? So it's a nice balance that we have to kind of grapple with. So I appreciate that.
Stephanie, Gentle, Reg, Chris, thank you. Thank you so much for your wisdom, for your generosity in this conversation. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure folk who are listening in have as well. Again, thank you so much. Be well.